All right, welcome back. And where we left off last time, we were talking about these neural circuits where neurons can converge onto other neurons with different strengths of activation, right? And that can instantiate different decision-making rules. And we covered the AND rule, the OR rule, the AND not, and the XOR rules. And we see that we can get some degree of complexity with those decision-making rules, even with just as few as three, or in the latter case, five neurons in a single network. It doesn't take maybe much of an imagination to think about how much more complexity in terms of decision-making rules if we started putting together even more neurons into a much more of a complex and convoluted neural network. But one thing we might want to think about here is this idea that neurons can have different strengths of input, right? And this comes from the concept of neuroplasticity that I mentioned in the previous video. And for that, we need to make sure we are comfortable and familiar with Hebb's law. We're probably going to mention Hebb's law a handful of times in this course. So let's make sure that we know what this is. This comes again from the same time frame, the 1940s and 50s, Donald Hebb working in trying to understand learning in the nervous system. And uh, there is this kind of shorthand phrase that we sometimes use to summarize Hebb's law, and it's described here. Neurons that fire together wire together. But the complete quote from Hebb is right here down below. When an axon of cell A is near enough to excite cell B and repeatedly or persistently takes part in firing it, some growth process or metabolic change takes place in one or both cells such that A's efficiency as one of the cells firing B is increased. That's a lot there. This is why we sometimes prefer the neurons that fire together, wire together, which is it's a metaphorical statement. When we say fire, we mean that the action potential is firing off. And when A activates B over and over again, as Hebb says here, repeatedly and persistently, then some kind of growth process or metabolic change takes place. And this is exactly what I said in the previous video. This is the ability of neuron A to synthesize more neurotransmitters or to have a few extra axon terminal branches, or neuron B is going to grow more dendrites, more dendritic spines, and more receptor sites. And one way or another, this efficiency of A activating B will increase. And that means that we can then think about how the signal strength, when we use those diagrams in the previous slides going from 1 to 2, right? That means an increase in signal strength because maybe that's what's happening with repeated activation. So over time, neurons can change their weights, and then we can form and create different kinds of decision-making circuits in the nervous system because of these changes in the weights here. This also allows us to understand how memory can be stored in a nervous system. This is where Hebb comes up with what's known as the dual trace hypothesis. It is also known as long-term potentiation. And what this refers to is the idea of potentiation refers to this increased sensitivity, right? It's just more easier to potentially activate the cell, right? And long-term meaning that these changes between the neurons can last a long time. So what's happening here is that when you have an experience, right? So you see something, let's imagine we're in childhood, right? And we're having lots of new experiences. We see things for the first time. And that initial experience causes a particular pattern of activity to spread across the cortex. So certain synapses will become active. And then the more that I have this same experience again and again and again, then the same patterns of neural activity become active again and again and again. And that means that this whole pattern of neural activity becomes easier to activate. And so then we might call that a memory trace, and reactivating that same pattern of activity in the future can happen even when I'm not having the experience, right? So let's say I'm seeing a toy, right? I'm 2 years old and I've got a new toy for Christmas, and I see it, and then I see it, and then I see it. So I'm having the same visual experiences over and over and over again. And then later on, I can simply remember and think about my favorite toy, and I'm activating the same uh, memory traces because I have created these potentiated synapses in the brain here. So that's one way to think about memory, but it's also a way of thinking about how learning happens. As I mentioned, that's what Hebb was trying to study here. And so let's advance a little bit with our understanding of a neural network, going from the simple McCulloch and Pitts circuitry here to what we might want to think of now as a trainable neural network. And this comes from Rosenblatt. It's called a perceptron, and it is called a perceptron because it is meant to be a neural network that might be capable of perceiving. Let's think of a simple situation here. You might be familiar with simple neural networks that can recognize. So, well, facial recognition software is a thing now, right? And actually, I mentioned David Marr in the first chapter, and so again, I said that a lot of this kind of computer vision work owes a debt to David Marr's research. So this is before David Marr, but it's kind of getting us in that direction. And so what's happening here is let's imagine that we have a computer program that can analyze digital images. So let's say I have a bunch of black and white digital photographs of let's just say a duck, right? And so what I want is I want my computer program to recognize pictures of ducks versus pictures of other things that are not ducks. So here we're going to have a true false kind of a situation, right? If the output of this program, we'll call that the Y neuron, as we used in the previous neural circuitry, returns true, that means that it thinks there's a duck in this photograph. If it says false, it thinks there is not a duck in the photograph, right? It might be confused sometimes though, right? So if there's a turtle in the picture, it might not be confused and it'll say false. But if there is another bird, let's say there's a pigeon in the photograph, maybe it'll say true because this program is not yet able to distinguish ducks from other kinds of birds, right? But it can distinguish ducks from turtles, right? But maybe over time it's going to even get better and better and better so that eventually this kind of program will consistently respond true when there's a duck and when false for every other case. And now we say that this program is what's called an image classifier, right? Because it can classify ducks from not ducks. That's all that's doing. You can give it 1,000 photographs with some subset of those being pictures of ducks, and it can sort and classify this whole stack of 1,000 photographs into the duck and not duck groups or classes, right? That's what this system can do. Why is that interesting? Because humans can do that very easily, right? We learn at a very early age what things look like, and we can recognize ducks and pigeons and all kinds of things and classify them very, very well. And so the idea here is that we want to understand how a neural network could possibly achieve this effect. And this is what Rosenblatt's trying to do here. So we have our input layer, right? And this is labeled here with i's instead of x's like we did before. So we have I, the subscript of 0, all the way up to some large number of different input layers. What is the input here? Well, that's that digital photograph I'm talking about, but it might be helpful to have a little more specificity here. So let's think about a digital photograph. And for simplicity, let's imagine these are all black and white photographs, so we don't have to deal with color. So in a black and white photograph, especially a digital image, you're going to have a bunch of pixels, right? And every pixel in the digital photograph is going to have a brightness value. And it's going to be shades of gray. There are going to be some that have a maximum brightness value. Those will be little white squares in the pixel in the image. Others will have a very, very low brightness value, and those will be little black squares. But there's going to be a lot of shades of gray as well. So you're going to have a bunch of pixel values with different brightness levels, right? And so you could have, if it's a large, high-resolution image, right, you're going to have thousands of pixels here. And so that's our input layer, is thousands of different pixels with different brightness values. And that's going to feed into, let's ignore the weights for a second. That's going to feed into this summation. That's the first pink box there with the big sigma there. It's going to add up all of the i's. Again, we're ignoring the w's, the weights for a second. It's just going to add up all of the y's until that hits some number. And that takes us into our activation function, right? So this is this little sigmoid curve. And if we're to the left-hand side, then it's below zero, it's negative, or we're basically returning false. But if the sum of all of these I values is large enough, it crosses the threshold and we jump up to a true statement, right? So the output function here is again, it's one or the other. It's all or nothing. It's either on the left-hand side of that vertical axis, it's false. On the right-hand side, it is true. And that's it. So we just have to cross the activation function and the output is true or false. So now what happens is when I first have this program that I want it to recognize ducks, I'm going to feed it a picture. And it's not going to know, right? It doesn't know what a duck is. It doesn't know what kinds of brightness values in an image should contain a duck. But let's say it's going to guess, right? So it guesses, and it might be right. More likely, it's going to be wrong. So what we do is we give it feedback. We say, all right, that was wrong. And so what happens here is that when this system receives feedback, it goes and it sets the weights to different numbers, right? So now what happens is that input I sub 0 has a certain weight associated with it. And that weight refers to how much that particular input value is important or not. And if it's very important to the presence or absence of a duck, then it's going to have a stronger weight associated with it. And some of the other input values might have lower weights because they're not so critically important. And so when the system guesses wrong, it starts changing its weights dynamically, almost randomly, really. And then it keeps getting things wrong, and it keeps resetting the weights, and it keeps getting things wrong, and it keeps resetting the weights until suddenly it gets one right. And so it says, okay, there's something here. So let's not change all the weights randomly now. Let's keep some of that, change some of the weights, but not all of them. And let's see if we get more right. And so as the system keeps getting more and more of its guesses correctly, it keeps kind of fine-tuning the values of these weights until now it gets correct more and more and more, and fewer incorrect feedback responses here. So that's what is required here, is we have to give the system some kind of feedback. We have to tell it when it's working and when it's not working. But once we give it this kind of feedback, it will keep, like I said, iteratively adjusting the weights until it works. This is what we mean when we talk about training a neural network, right? So if you've heard about AIs and their training data, this is what it is, right? You have to give it thousands and thousands of images of ducks and not ducks, and you have to give it a lot of feedback so that it knows which images are part of the category it's training for and which ones are not. Obviously, modern deep learning kinds of algorithms are a bit more complicated than just recognizing one thing versus everything else, but still, the concept is here. Now, here's another way that we can get into the idea of a neural network, but now let's move away from the conceptualized artificial neural network of the McCulloch and Pitts neuron, or the perceptron, and let's look at a very famous discovery in neuroscience. This is Hubel and Weisel's research here on cells in the cat's visual cortex. So hopefully this will work. Now, you may have seen this stuff before. We don't really need the audio here. I don't know if that's even coming through, so I'll just turn that off. What we're doing is we are recording the activity of neurons in a cat's visual cortex. So we have inserted a microelectrode into the cat's visual cortex, and we are presenting the cat with a stimulus here, and that's this bar of light. Let me turn the audio on. Maybe this will work. You see what happens here is that when this bar of light lands on a very specific location where those X's were marked, you hear this staticky sound. And if you download the PowerPoint, if the audio is not working, you can download the PowerPoint and click this link and watch the video through that. But it's that staticky sound is actually an audio recording of the action potentials coming from the neurons. So what's happening here is that when a particular pattern of input values, of brightness values in the image are in the correct location and in the correct orientation, we get a set of neurons that become active, right? And therefore they have true values. But the triangles down below and also above are part of what's called the inhibitory region. So those are also going to have certain values, in this case, maybe negative values. So maybe now we're seeing here a neural network that has some excitatory and inhibitory signals. And so a complex set of IPSPs and EPSPs, right? And maybe XOR rules and not rules and this kind of stuff. And what we're also seeing here is that the cell is highly orientation specific, right? You have to have, once you move the bar of light to a different angle that's not perfectly aligned to those lines that have been made there, then the cell doesn't really respond anymore. It has to be perfectly aligned, just like that. I think that's enough here, right? So this is what we know about how the nervous system works in terms of the visual cortex, right? We know that these cells called simple cells have these kinds of ability to respond to lines that have just the right orientation and just the right location of the visual field. They have excitatory and inhibitory regions. And then what we have here is a much more recent attempt at taking what we know about the activity of all of these cells and constructing an artificial neural network that works as a simulation of that is then able to explain how the visual system can be modeled here as a neural network, as an artificial neural network here. So we're mapping the input layer, which is the actual photoreceptors themselves, right? Which photoreceptors are active, right? Which ones are getting hit with light and which ones are not. They have brightness levels, just like the pixels in the digital image that I talked about before. They send a bunch of complex signals of varying strengths to the simple cells, which are the cells in the visual cortex. And then these converge onto higher level cells that we can call complex cells. And those are going to respond with different outputs, such as maybe a true and false kind of output. And we don't need to worry about the specific details of this neural network. I just want to include it for the sake of showing that we can create a neural network, an artificial neural network that functions in a way that is very much like a real biological neural system, as discovered by Hubel and Wiesel in the early 1960s. This is another good place to stop. So we will move on from there in the third video for this particular chapter on cognitive neuroscience.